Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Johnson Shayama Graduate School Public Lecture, Greenhouse Gas Emission Reductions in Canada through Electrification of Energy Services, presented by Mr. Alan Fogwell, President and CEO of the Canadian Energy Research Institute, or CERI for short. Did I get that right? The Johnson Shayama Graduate School of Public Policy is a provincial centre for advanced study and research in public policy and administration. The school is a product of a partnership between the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan and was based on the spirit of cooperation and collaboration that defines Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is renowned for its innovation, and the Johnson Shayama Graduate School is yet another example of this, with combined expertise and resources of the two universities, which has allowed it to create the school a source of respected policy advice and commentary. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge that today's event is taking place on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 land and the traditional homeland of the Métis. My name is Margot Hurlbert. I'm an associate professor here at Johnson Shayama, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. As many of you know, we are one school, two campuses, so I'd extend a warm welcome to our colleagues and guests at the University of Saskatchewan, where the event is moderated by Dr. Beth Schwartz of Johnson Shayama in Saskatoon. Today, the school is extremely pleased to welcome Mr. Alan Fogwell. Mr. Fogwell joined the Canadian Energy Research Institute in November of 2014 as President and Chief Executive Officer. An energy sector executive with over 25 years' experience in both public and private sector, Mr. Fogwell's background has focused on economics and market analysis of energy sector issues, along with policy developments related to energy regulation and efficiency issues. Mr. Fogwell has previously worked for natural gas distribution companies in British Columbia and Ontario, and for the Ontario Energy Board, dealing with market analysis and analysis of distribution costs. Prior to assuming his role at CERI, Mr. Fogwell provided regulatory consulting services to local distribution companies in Ontario. So we're thrilled to have Mr. Fogwell here today to talk about the study of CERI on the energy system, environmental and economic implications of transforming the energy end-use conversion technology mix into one dominated by electricity in the residential, commercial, and passenger road transportation sectors. So following the talk, we will entertain questions, but for now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Alan Fogwell.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here at the University of Regina School of Public Policy. Just one note, as part of my background, I am a graduate of the University of Saskatchewan, so don't hold that against me. So I'm very much pleased that we've got some folks from Saskatoon here. It's a much bigger campus, and they have better parties. So, before I get started, let me give you a preface of where we came to embarking on this debate. Over the last year, there's been some comments made by governments in Ontario and the federal government about electrification being one of the major policy tools to achieve a carbon reduction to meet the targets of 2030 and 2050. The 2030 target is, of course, 30% below 2005 levels, and the 2050 target, which is not as engraved in stone, is 80% below 2005 levels. So what we wanted to do was really provide some information. I'm not going to call them facts because there's a lot of scenario analysis and assumptions associated with this. It's information on the possible outcomes associated with these policies. And it's something we do at the organization on a regular basis. We try and take current issues and put some facts and information around it, so people aren't making decisions in a vacuum. So just a little bit about our organization in order to give you an understanding of the type of work we do and the quality of the work we do. So we've been around since 1975, and our mission is to provide independent and objective research. One of the aspects of that is we don't make recommendations and we don't suggest policy. The reason why we don't do that is to keep a neutral stance in the debate. Policy advocates will take our information and use it to their own ends. But in that sort of transfer, you're starting to get people using a values judgment as opposed to just facts and figures. So as a result, we try and walk the middle line and don't have any particular issue with respect to where the conversation is going, with the exception that it go in a place that is well justified based on the available information. We're a not-for-profit organization. These are our current funders: Government of Canada, Government of Alberta, Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, the Chemical Industry Association of Canada, Alberta's Industrial Heartland, University of Calgary, and the Korean Energy Economics Institute. So we have a broad reach. We're looking to be as broad as possible going across the country. But this identifies that we have a number of different organizations that are helping us out and keeping us going. We also get support from the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Petroleum Services Association of Canada. So what I want to talk to you today is about electrification. So the scenario we're looking at is to move the residential and commercial and passenger transportation end uses all towards electricity. Most of us in the room will heat our homes with a natural gas furnace. We'll move that to electric furnace or electric baseboard. Same with your water heater. Move that to electric, which is even more common. On the commercial side, there's a lot of electrification already with space heating, but moving more of that towards electricity would be the approach. And in terms of passenger vehicles, we're talking about moving from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. So we went across the country. We're looking at the 10 provinces and the 3 sectors that I mentioned. A couple of points with respect to the scope of the analysis. We looked at commercially ready or near commercially ready technology. So there's nothing in here that's fancy and got new approaches to doing anything. These are shelf-ready technologies that we can use today. The other thing is we didn't include the industrial sector or the freight transportation sector. Both of those are very much complicated, and it's one of our future evaluation projects that we're going to be looking at. But for now, we want to take a snapshot at the very simple sectors that we have in place and look at what would be the impact of moving those to all electric services. Key to what we were talking about here is what is the scale of the emissions reductions that can be achieved through electrification. So one of the things to keep in mind as we go through this is we're not changing the size of your house. We're not changing the number of cups of coffee that you have every morning. We're not changing how far it takes you to get to work. None of that is changing. There is no social aspect to the change in electricity or energy use. It is solely a replacement of technologies to provide you the same service today. So that means we haven't taken into account a lot of energy efficiency options that could be used, which could make a difference in terms of the overall cost impacts of moving towards electrification. Now, for the modelers in the room, this is your one slide, okay? So we're taking the existing stock, the technologies that are providing the service today, and we're rolling that over in 5-year increments and simulating what the change in stock and the change in demand for the different services would be over time. We also are taking into account inertia. So, for example, when we're looking at the transportation sector, we have to keep in mind the fact that we've got a lot of infrastructure already built to serve the current transportation demands, all the service stations around the country. So we'd have to slowly be moving those towards electric charging stations. Just to show the magnitude of the issue and how it differs across the country, and what was interesting about this and the slides coming forward is the debate that we're having across the country is tense, for lack of a better word. And we'll have some people in different provinces saying that moving towards an electrification scenario is relatively cheap, relatively easy, and others saying, well, it's not. It's relatively more expensive and a lot harder to do. And the reason for that is they're coming at it from different perspectives. So, for example, if you're looking at Quebec, where the electricity share is already significant, 65%, and its emissions are quite low, 2.1. In that case, because of their the assets they have in hydroelectricity, it's much easier for them to move towards electrification than it would be for Saskatchewan, where you have 13% electrification right now and very high 780 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. And of course we know that's because there's a predominance of coal-fired electricity here, as well as Alberta. We see that in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So when people are talking about how much it's going to cost, and they have different numbers and different perspectives, they're coming at it honestly. So the real point when you're having these debates is to say, hold on. We're not talking about this from the same perspective. And to be able to realize that could go a long way to having a more rational debate about where it's good to do this and where it may not be good to do this, or where it's good to do this and we don't need incentives, and where it's more difficult and you do need incentives. What we did was we generated 3 scenarios. That's what we do in research. We have a business as usual scenario, and that does take into account all new or current policies that have been announced. So, for example, when I get to the slides later, this was developed before the Saskatchewan government came to an agreement with the federal government about the longevity of the coal plants. Right? So under that scenario, where the coal plants were going to be forced out by 2030 or thereabouts, that would be a sunk cost and therefore not included. But now, if we're moving towards this electrification scenario and we're moving towards higher levels of renewables, as you can see, then that actually imposes an additional cost on Saskatchewan. So we've taken it as a snapshot in time, and then a month later we get a policy change that makes a significant impact in part of our analysis. That is part of the relevant nature of the work we're doing. We're trying to apply the most recent information to give people a good understanding about where to go next. And it takes a month or 2 months, and by that time you're into another situation. So the high renewables, and the 2 supply scenarios of the high renewables and high renewables plus natural gas combined cycle. Generally speaking, the high renewables is in the 60% range, and the high renewable plus natural gas combined cycle with carbon capture and storage, the renewables there are about 50%. So what did we find? We've got some pretty pictures here. Let me tell you what we found. So in terms of the residential sector, the green is electricity. The orange is natural gas. The dark blue is oil, and the light blue is other. So in Atlantic Canada, where we've been seeing a decline in their overall GDP and growth, that decline in electricity or in overall energy use is going down, but not by much. And the same can be said for Ontario and Saskatchewan. We still have some natural gas being used because of the inertia of the infrastructure. Not a lot, but still some there. In the case of Atlantic Canada, of course, there's a lot more heating with fuel oil than with natural gas because of the lack of access. But what this tells you is that our natural gas system to deliver for end-use consumption is reasonably efficient. If you think about the overall system efficiency of natural gas, takes it from the ground through the pipes into the furnace, which can be in the 90 to 95% efficient range, you're looking at an efficiency between 85 to 90%. If you take the same natural gas, it's in there in some of the work we're doing. If you take the same natural gas, burn it in a combined cycle plant, you're getting 50 to 55%, plus the losses on the line. And once you get into the house, it's practically 100%. But that overall system efficiency is not as large as it would be if you're delivering natural gas to the home. So if you're looking at converting your end use to electricity and you're using natural gas, that is actually going to increase the amount of greenhouse gas emissions for that service. So that's the reason for the renewables. The renewables need to be in there and to keep the overall electricity supply system reduced in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions. When we were doing this study, this next slide actually really impressed me. And this is passenger transportation. And you can see in all three areas, Atlantic Canada, Ontario, and Saskatchewan, you get a huge benefit going to electric vehicles. And the reason for that is right now our internal combustion engines are 25% efficient. If you included or replace those with electric vehicles, you're looking at a 75% efficient system. And that's significant. Now, the important part about this slide is we made an assumption that the electric vehicles aren't mature enough to be a mass market penetration right now. So we started the penetration of these vehicles after 2030, roughly about 2035. So if our assumption is wrong and the ability to move these electric vehicles into the mass market happens sooner, you're going to hit this benefit a lot sooner. But in terms of the electric vehicles, there is a significant improvement in energy use associated with switching from internal combustion to electric. Now, we had a lot of debates about this one in particular, and the reason we did is because there's a fair amount of discussion going on that EVs are going to come in at the same time as autonomous vehicles. And autonomous vehicles, from our read of the literature to date, will throw a huge monkey wrench into our understanding of how people use transportation. My aunt, for example, won't drive because she doesn't like to. Right? Doesn't mean she doesn't need a car to get around. But if she's got an autonomous vehicle, she can get that car to drive around wherever she wants. Right? Same goes for people who are commuting downtown and don't want to pay, the steep parking charges. So they take their car downtown, they tell it to go home, and tell them to pick them up at 5 o'clock. So instead of one trip, you've now got two. So there's a lot of issues with respect to where the electric vehicles are going to take us, especially when we layer on top the autonomous nature of some of the new vehicles coming out. And that's definitely room for a lot of discussion. On the commercial side, it's very much the same as residential. We see growth in the commercial sector, and even though we're moving more towards electricity, we're seeing not as much in the way of a reduction in the overall energy use because of the very little difference in system efficiency that we get moving towards electrification. The result is you take the commercial sector, you move it towards electrification. The residential sector, you move it towards electrification. The passenger transportation sector, you move it towards electrification. You need electricity, a lot more of it. So this is the relative change in the amount of electricity that's needed by province based on moving just those three sectors. So in the case of Saskatchewan, which is pink, hope you don't mind, you're looking at 175, 80% of your existing footprint. So if you've got whatever the size is of the grid right now, you're looking at a 1.8 times impact on that footprint. Like you, I watch the TV and we see issues about infrastructure projects, mostly pipelines right now, but also other things related to roads, even parks in some cases people don't like. But what we're talking about here is if we're moving towards electrification, we need to get the electricity from somewhere. This assumes assumes the grid-based model. And there are two interacting issues that we did not take into account. One is the fact that if we're looking at renewable technologies, they are of lower density, meaning larger physical footprint. And we also didn't take into account distributed energy within the grid. So one is going to help reduce that growth in physical footprint. The other is going to increase that growth in the physical footprint. How those two interact, we don't know. Generally speaking, what this means is more electricity generation, more electricity transmission, more electricity distribution. So just showing you the three main ones here that we're focusing on in this talk. One is Atlantic Canada, looking at an increase of 1.5, or in Ontario, we're looking at an increase of 2.5, and in Saskatchewan, we're looking at an increase of 1.8 times the size of the grid. I'm going to talk about costs in a minute, but in terms of the observations coming out of this research, this is quite significant. And intuitively, I'm sure we would all know that. But when you get some numbers like this that suggest we're going to have a huge build-out of the electricity grid, we're going to have challenges associated with siting. Okay, so efficiency improvements in the residential sector. We get some, depending on where we're going. For example, Atlantic Canada, the oil furnaces are not very efficient compared to natural gas. So you see a large efficiency improvement in residential fuel consumption. In Quebec, you see some of that. Ontario, not so much because of the infrastructure in place to provide natural gas home heating. Manitoba, we see it. Saskatchewan, again, predominance of natural gas and home heating. Same with Alberta, and same with British Columbia. So we see our most significant improvement in the Atlantic region because of the poor, relatively poor stock of equipment that's being replaced. This one is really nice. I like this one. Oh. Transportation. It's phenomenal. Huge efficiency improvements. The electric vehicle, if we're looking at it from an energy economics perspective, the electric vehicle by far outshines the internal combustion vehicle. 60%, 66%, 50, 69, 56, 50, 60, 61. That's a huge improvement. And it all has to do with the fact that we're moving towards a completely different drivetrain. Okay, so we go through all this pain. What kind of results do we get? Well, in 2030, the closest anyone gets by moving all three of these sectors as much as possible over to electricity is Ontario. They get 14%. They're supposed to get 30, they get 14%. They're just halfway there. This is a significant disruption on everyone's lives. They got to pull out their furnaces. They've got to reconfigure their commercial buildings. They have to replace their truck and their SUV, and we still get 14%. Pulling out all the stops. All right. And in 2050, you're looking at 35 and 31% at the top end, and the target's 80. So not even halfway. So part of this, the conclusions coming from this analysis is the challenge. The challenge being that business as usual in terms of how we use electricity or natural gas or whatever needs to be a major component of a policy if it's to be effective in reaching either target. It also means we need to look at the other two sectors. All right. So we talked about the overall reduction associated with residential, commercial, and passenger transportation. We've included freight transportation and industrial on these graphs, and you can see that they still present a significant portion of the overall demand. So what that means is if we're looking at these targets and we want to get there, at the very least, all these sectors need to be involved. The issue with going into the freight transportation and industrial sector is you start muddling around with the economy. And if you start moving around doing things with these two primary sectors related to improving energy efficiency and reducing the use of fossil fuels, we need to make sure that we're doing it in a way that doesn't undermine their activities. Otherwise, we are robbing Peter to pay Paul. Now, we haven't done any work with respect to that. That's part of some of the discussions we're having at the Institute right now. And we might get to that in next year. But what we've been able to do is separate those indirect economic sectors from the direct economic sectors and seeing what we can do with the indirect first and then going after the really hard ones, which is freight transportation and industry. So what would it cost? And I mentioned this to you before. In terms of things moving forward without stopping. And the scenarios in Saskatchewan were based on the coal mines being retired by 2030. So in that case, what you get is an average system cost associated with bringing in a high percentage of renewables, or a high percentage of renewables plus gas gas carbon capture and storage. You get avoided costs that's lower than most in the country. $65 per ton in one scenario and $58 per ton in another scenario. And what you're also seeing is at the end of the 2050 period, you've got a 29% increase in the delivered price of electricity to the home relative to business as usual. So business as usual is 1% to 2%. This adds on another 2% to 3% to get you to a incremental difference of 29% at the end of 2030. So 30% more than what you would otherwise be paying. So this is over and above inflation. Is that something that people would consider inexpensive, too expensive? Look at what's going on in Ontario with the increases in electricity prices there. Ontario is going to be taking some of its electricity bills and paying for it through its provincial treasury. You can decide whether that's a good policy or not. It's also locked in with very expensive contracts for the next 20 years, and trying to figure out how to pay for $1.5 billion investment in smart meters and $1 billion investment in moving to natural gas plants. All right. So if you add in all those elements, is 29% or 30% increase in the overall price of your electricity bill a good thing or a bad thing? And for that, you really have to look at affordability and ways in which people can be helped to manage their electricity bill. If we looked at this Saskatchewan study with the fact that the coal power plants were not going to be retired, then the price here would be in the range of $200 a ton. So you're much in the vein of some of the other provinces that are dealing with high amounts of coal-based electricity. And that increase in price would be much higher as well, maybe in the 75% range. So 75% increase over a constantly inflating electricity price at the end of this period, 75% increase in the retail bill for not even achieving half of your carbon emissions targets, and having to build at least a double the grid that you have right now. That's the discussion. That's the debate. Just as an example as well, Ontario, we're looking at $124 a ton on average, and a 77% increase in the final bill. Ontario is in tough shape in terms of its electricity system for decades. No matter what the government says right now, they've locked in and they've spent, and they're going to have to pay for it. So this 77% may not be paid on the bill. It may be paid in their taxes. One way or the other, they've gone down some of this route already, and it's going to be a significant issue for us all. The reason being is Ontario is still a huge part of the Canadian economy. If Ontario catches a cold, the rest of us are dead. Atlantic Canada gets off kind of easy. Part of the reason for that is we've built in the Muskrat Falls project. So that's already built in. They have a ways to go. $14 avoided cost. That's even cheaper than the current price that the federal government wants people to put on carbon right now. It's cheaper than what's being put on carbon in Ontario, in Alberta and also British Columbia. All right, but it still means an increase in the price of the retail price of electricity. One of the things I was adamant about when we were doing this study is show the retail price of electricity. And the reason for that is the lesson we learned when the Green Energy Act was put in place in Ontario. There was no clear understanding about what the impact was going to be on the retail customer. So on top of the impact was a surprise and a feeling of betrayal on the part of politicians because they weren't well enough informed to tell them the truth about where their electricity bills were going to go. It's not like it was going to be a secret, right? It's not like something that they could hide from the public every time people open their bill and see something creeping up. They're going to start to question, they're going to start to wonder. It doesn't necessarily mean you can't make the hard choices, but you definitely need to be honest with people. So, where am I? Concluding remarks. With a significant push towards electrification in all services in the commercial, residential, and passenger transportation sectors, which a lot of advocates of climate change management have suggested, we are not even going to get close to our targets. We went through with current commercial technologies. We applied them where we thought it was reasonable given market conditions. We did not change the demand for end-use services. It was just a switch out on the technology side. And what we found is that the industrial sector and the freight transportation sector are vital if we're going to get to that level. So it's an all-hands-on-deck kind of approach. We need all the end-use sectors to be looking at electrification where possible. We need electricity utilities to be as efficient as possible in terms of providing low carbon energy. That doesn't mean getting rid of fossil fuels. What it means is low carbon energy. We don't have an energy problem, we have a carbon problem. And if we can scrub the carbon out of our natural gas and our coal plants, there is absolutely no reason why they couldn't be kept on to provide service into the future. No reason whatsoever. I think the last point I'd like to leave you with is that it's not going to be simple. Even doing this type of straightforward exchange of one technology for another, it's going to cost money. There's going to be disruptions in our society, and there will be winners and losers. It's not as expensive as some people might say. It is going to cost money. The real question is whether we're willing to spend that money to move us in this direction and still not hit the targets we're trying to hit. So that becomes very much a political issue. If we ask everyone to make these sacrifices, to make these changes to their daily life, and we say, thank you very much, and by the way, even when you do all this stuff, we're only going to get halfway there, that's a political challenge. And that's going to require people to look beyond that point, moving from single-family dwellings into apartments, closer to the downtown, so they don't have as much transportation demand. Car sharing, higher degree of public transit, things that are related to the social aspects of how we live our lives. The technology side will not get us there alone. Thank you very much.